including operational deletions related to GDPR, are both in Raw Vault, but particularly in Business Vault and Information Marts as well. So, Michael, being that you are our resident European here and probably the most exposed to GDPR, we're going to start with you.
Okay, cool. So first of all, I would distinguish between operational and GDPR-related deletions. So operational deletions, let's say you're using Data Vault for a more operational system, I would try, if there's no legal requirement or organizational requirement to delete data, I would just avoid that. I would just historize the data as it comes, essentially historize it in the Data Vault, that's it, in the raw Data Vault, and that's it. If there's an organizational requirement or a legal requirement that you have to delete data, for example, when a consumer exercises the right to be forgotten, and you can complain to or you can essentially talk to the you can exercise the right to be forgotten, and in this case you have to delete data because there's a legal requirement. The thing is that in this case the key principle here is separation. You have to separate the personal data from the non-personal data, or let's say in more broad terms, there might be more classes than two classes. The easy game is if you have two classes, non-personal data, personal data, but you could have as many classes you want. You have to separate data by each class essentially. So that's number one. And to be honest, we typically simplify it a bit in saying by privacy class, but to be honest, it's actually by data retention period. So if you have, let's say, one set of personal attributes, but some attributes you can keep longer than the other ones, you have to separate by data retention periods. That defines a class essentially. And then we separate the data column by column, essentially in using a satellite split, at least in a relational database. And then the trick is essentially to delete the data when essentially consumer request comes in. We delete the deltas for this particular customer from the personal satellite. For the Business Vault and for the Information Mart, it's easy as long as you virtualize. Because the only thing what you have to do is afterwards, you have to drop after the deletion of those deltas, you have to delete drop the partition from the pit table and rebuild it. It will activate the ghost record and anonymize your customer dimension member essentially. That's it. Problem solved. If you materialize data, one requirement for the Business Vault is that you can always truncate the table and rerun the business rules. You should come up with the exact same data in the compute satellite, in the Business Vault, for example, and so on. Which means that if you build your solution fully incremental, you can always delete certain, like those records belonging to the same hash key as the consumer. Just delete those records from the materialized Business Vault entity and restart the process of loading the data incrementally into the target entity. That should rebuild those entity records. And essentially, because you can't find a description, let's say you're using some personal attribute for your business rule, so be it. If you're using a pit table in this regard, the pit table would activate the ghost record from the satellite, and you're working with defaults in your business rule because that's the only thing you have. You don't know where the customer came from, or let's say what the last name was of the customer, because it's forgotten. So you have to work with defaults. That's what it is. So that's the basic principles. Separation is the key.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sounds like the last part of the question was some insights into automating that process would be greatly appreciated. I think you've probably covered on that. Nols, did you have anything to add?
One of the elements for that automation is you need a register that says, please forgive me. I mean, it's the first fundamental. You need to know which business key or which person or which person is asked to be forgotten.
Yeah.
And so most organizations, well, at least I can speak to the Australian, New Zealand context, no organization has that register at all. So although GDPR legislation do apply down under, that first sort of hygiene factor of have a register, know that this is a request, know that you need to be compliant to this, and then you can appropriately architect and build accordingly. So there's a fair bit that goes into that process, not just from a warehouse or a information management perspective, but it has cascading effects in your operational systems and so on as well. So the interesting challenge is that your data warehouse, your data vault, is your corporate memory, and now you need to institute selective amnesia. Um, and then this is only if there is no outstanding court cases or investigations, and so all of these things need to be washed against quite a few other checks and balances before we can just go, okay, fine. Now, Michael has very nicely identified the first rule of success for GDPR is and isolate the things that are the truly sensitive elements, and that becomes a very small problem to deal with. The rest of it's still relevant. We never get rid of any of the references to a particular business key in the relationships they participated. You may make those relationships inactive, so your effectivity satellites will come back into play, and so your sophistication around the rules around what is considered to be deleted or not then comes into play. And so we've got quite a bit of additional cascade of some of these effects. The best thing is let your source systems actually give you or guide you into what these things should be, what is the behaviors around them. And if you do get a delete, is this in fact a GDPR delete, or is this in fact an operational delete where it's legitimately just deleted, it was wrong kind of activity. So it does add a little bit of complexity in the event types, and our traditional approaches or our traditional tools for CDC, change data capture, doesn't necessarily give you that insight at this stage. You may simply get a delete, and you'll have to wash that against your register. So there's some practicalities to bear in mind. It's great to try to wrap your mind around how the GDPR behaviors need to be in the vault, but don't forget about the hygiene, the back-end components that needs to be in place to make this actually feasible. 2 cents worth.
Yep.
Wow, it's such a big topic too. I mean, I know, Michael, it's probably a bit different for you guys in Europe, but down here we're doing lots of PII assessments, so the personally identifiable data assessments, to help people understand where that PII data actually is right now, because we've got lots of people who don't really know where they're storing all of that information, and so, as you say, getting a good view of it to start with. I suspect you're probably a fair bit further on, being that GDPR is applied in Europe.
Yeah, we got some good experience here.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, part of the value of this community is actually like leveraging the things that are happening in different regions. You know, GDPR applies to a lot of companies down here because they also operate in Europe or have customers in Europe and those sorts of things. So we're definitely got lots of organisations that are aware of it, but I think we're not as mature in that front. So.